Hello, I'm Ana Cabrera reporting from New York, and we begin with the big breaking news, a dramatic 180 from President Trump on the Iran war. With just hours left before his deadline to attack Iran's biggest power plant, President Trump now says the U.S. and Iran have held productive talks for the past 2 days. And as a result, he says he is pausing attacks on Iran's energy facilities. Here's more of what he said about all of this just moments ago.
We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement. I would say almost all points of agreement. Perhaps that hasn't been conveyed. The communication, as you know, has been blown to pieces. They're unable to talk to each other. But we've had very strong talks. Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner had them. They went, I would say, perfectly.
President Trump wouldn't say who the White House is dealing with, but he insisted, quote, this is regime change. Yet Iranian media and officials are reportedly denying all of this. They're saying no negotiations have taken place. Let's go to the region now with MS Now reporter David Noriega in Jerusalem. Also with us, retired Marine Colonel Mark Cancian of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. David, what more do we know about any kind of diplomacy that's happening that led to these postponed strikes?
Well, Anna, we know extremely little, and what we do know seems confusing and contradictory. As you pointed out, what we're hearing from Tehran, I should point out, we're not hearing it from directly from official sources in Tehran. A lot of what we're hearing is from the Mehr News Agency, which is a semi-official, sort of state-aligned but not officially state news organization, which is denying that Tehran is holding any kind of talks with Washington. They're saying that this is instead Washington backing down after Tehran's threats of widespread retaliation against energy and other civilian infrastructure in the region should Trump have followed through with his threat to attack Iranian power plants. So it's not clear whether those talks have even been taking place. There's no ceasefire, certainly. Just this morning here in Jerusalem, there was an interception of an Iranian ballistic missile, which was headed towards this part of the country. We saw a couple of Iranian missiles make it through the air defense system in the last 24 to 48 hours. The reaction here in Israel is, given how confusing the basic facts are in this case, the reaction here in Israel is mixed. I spoke to a retired general of the Israeli Armed Forces who said that he doesn't necessarily have a problem with Trump negotiating with the Iranians as long as he's not backing down from the demands that they dismantle their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program, etc. Sort of trying to minimize the notion that this might represent bad news for Israel. That is going to be one of the big things going forward. If it is in fact true, if it proves to be true that Donald Trump is holding negotiations with Tehran and that there might be in the near future a scenario in which the United States pulls out from this war, that's going to put Israel in a tough position because Israel at this point does not want this war to end. What we've been hearing from Israeli officials in recent days is that they're about midway through the fighting. They expect it to last for several more weeks. So they're going to be in a tough position if they're left alone in this war after Trump pulls out, if he in fact does so, Anna.
Let me follow up on that piece, because Israel was the entity that struck that gas field in Iran last week. And of course, there was question about whether or not the U.S. approved of that strike. Are they part of any potential talks or pauses on these strikes we just heard the president speak about?
No, not as far as we know. And what we're hearing from the Israeli government, from Israeli officials, again, is a posture that's completely antithetical to the notion of talks. They're in full war posture. A couple of officials have said that they expect the fighting to last at least through Passover, so several more weeks. There is absolutely no indication that Israel has any kind of desire to back away from this or negotiate in any way. In fact, they're also pretty substantially escalating hostilities in southern Lebanon towards Hezbollah. Just today, they bombed a really critical bridge that connects northern to southern Lebanon. A lot of analysts say that this is sort of a prelude to a ground invasion. The question of Iran's proxies in the region, primarily Hezbollah, is a huge question for Israel. They're trying to take advantage of this war to, neutralize Hezbollah and potentially other proxies in the region as well. So again, we don't actually know what's happening yet. There's a lot of contradictory information, but if it is in fact true that Trump is seeking for a way out of this conflict and seeking for a way out soon, then that would put him pretty directly at odds with Israel at this particular moment in the war.
Colonel Cancian, what is your reaction to the whiplash of comments we've heard from the president over the past 48 hours and Iran's denial.
Well, it's important to keep in mind, as we heard, there are at least 4 different parties to these negotiations. Of course, it's the U.S. and Israel is whoever we're talking to. And then there's the Revolutionary Guards. They're the people with the guns. They appear to have dominance in Iran. Any deal that's made will need their acceptance. Not clear that that's going to happen. We all hope, of course, that we may get a deal out of this and that the war might end. But we have to get a lot of people to agree. Not clear that that's going to be easy or quick.
David, President Trump didn't mention the Strait of Hormuz this morning, and that was a big piece of his social media post when he threatened to strike Iran's energy facilities. Has the situation changed at all in the Strait, and do we know if Gulf nations were pushing Trump to de-escalate?
We don't know the situation. As far as we know, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz has not changed. And you're right to say that that was, in fact, at the core of the threat that Donald Trump made to Iran. That is really sort of the decisive factor in the conflict at this point, is whether Iran is going to allow oil tankers to move through the Strait and onward to Asia. I don't have any concrete reporting on whether or not the Gulf countries have been involved in these talks. However, there has been pretty extensive reporting over the last few days about Gulf countries pressuring the United States to find a way to de-escalate the aspect of this war that has specifically to do with attacks on oil and energy infrastructure, because that affects them very, very directly. You know, yesterday when Iran was outlining the steps that it would ostensibly take in retaliation for any kind of attack on power infrastructure in Iran, sort of chief among that was equivalent power and energy infrastructure in countries in the region that host military bases, which primarily refers to the Gulf states. So whether the Gulf states are formally involved in, again, we don't even know if the negotiations between Washington and Tehran are actually happening. We're getting contradictory information about that. But if there are, in fact, negotiations, we don't know at this point whether the Gulf countries are directly involved in them. But we do know that the Gulf countries are applying substantial pressure on Trump and on the United States to find a way to de-escalate that aspect of this war that is affecting them very directly and to get the Strait of Hormuz reopened.
There is a complete lack of clarity this morning, Colonel, on who is talking to whom, what exactly is the nature of those talks. We did hear from the president again this morning saying this is regime change, and previously he has said that the U.S. killed any replacement leadership in Iran who might have been able to negotiate. Do you have any sense of who may be leading talks for Iran at this stage?
I would hesitate to guess. But I would emphasize that the Revolutionary Guards, very hard line, are in control in Iran, and any deal would need to get their acceptances. Keep in mind, they've got hundreds of thousands of troops available, so they have the guns on the ground.
I want to bring in Sky News International Affairs editor Dominic Waghorn in Turkey. And you were just in Iran, Dominic. What do you make of these new comments from President Trump?
Well, I think we have to treat them with a pinch of salt, don't we? Because the American president has been all over the parking lot in what he said about the objectives and the progress of this air campaign he and the Israelis are waging. A lot of what he said has kind of contradicted itself. I mean, today he's now saying that there has been regime change because there are different people in charge in Tehran. Well, if he means, yes, there are different people who are more hard-line than Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was assassinated on the first day, then that is true. But I don't think that was the objective of that airstrike, certainly not the objective of the American-Israeli offensive. He also said that the threat was imminent from a nuclear program, which he declared obliterated last year. So in a strange situation, really, aren't we, of the American president posting something and then us waiting to hear from the Iranians to see whether it's true or not. And certainly from what the Iranians are saying, and the diplomats I was with last week, the foreign ministry is today saying that there are no direct or indirect talks with America, although regional allies are trying to create some kind of indirect process. The Iranians are saying, and being pretty hard-lined about this, that the address for those attempts should be Washington and Jerusalem, because those are where the aggression came from, those two cities. And what the Iranian diplomat said to us in our week there in Tehran over the last week or so is that this is an illegal, unprovoked war. And therefore they can't engage in diplomacy until the hostilities have come to an end. I think the bottom line for the Iranians is that they feel that diplomacy has been used as a kind of charade, a masquerade for the Americans, both in the 12-day war last year and this time round in that diplomacy in Geneva, to allow the Americans and Israelis to put in place military action that was then used against the Iranians when they thought they were involved in diplomacy that was making progress. So they're not happy and they're not prepared to see that happen again. And so I think the sense we have is that they're going to carry on using the Strait of Hormuz as a kind of pressure point on the Americans and Israelis, and to make it clear to them that if that happens again, that pressure point can be closed again. So I think we're nowhere near the kind of progress that the American president is trying to project at the moment.